Oh dear. Okay. Valid. Okay. You know. Oh, 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 poo.
Awesome. Hey y'all, as you're joining, please feel free to put your name, pronouns, and where you're joining from in the chat, just to introduce yourself. And we just ask that folks put themselves on mute for now, just so that we can get through the presentation. But excited to have everyone on. I see so many familiar faces. Hey, Shakina Rose. Hey, Yolanda. Hey, Blue. Awesome. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen really quickly too for you all. All right. Hopefully everyone can see. All right, we'll start in another minute or so as people are joining. Again, please feel free to drop your name, pronouns, and where you're joining from. I see we have folks joining from Puerto Rico, Texas, Iowa, Pennsylvania, South Carolina. Super exciting. Awesome. Very cool. Missouri, hey Marcella.
Hello, hello.
Awesome, hello. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started because we have an awesome presentation for y'all today. I'm so excited to get into content with y'all and really scale build around policy advocacy today. I want to quickly introduce myself. My name is Amanda. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the If, When, How Reproductive Justice and HIV Fellow at Positive Women's Network USA. I am helping to manage and coordinate the PWN Policy Fellows this year, as well as co-coordinate alongside others such as Deidre and Elena, the HMP Advocates Program. So really excited to have everyone here today with us for our fourth web session on understanding federal administrative advocacy and legislative advocacy. We have an amazing group of experts who are deeply knowledgeable in both aspects of these types of advocacy. And I'm just really excited to introduce you to them and have them share with y'all today. So first, I wanted to provide a very quick primer on why we are here today. So we are doing a training series for our Health Not Prisons advocates, as well as our PWN policy fellows and our larger PWN membership, specifically geared around policy advocacy and skills building. So we will be doing these trainings once a month. And they will be on different aspects of policy advocacy. And I wanted to shout out the Health Not Prisons advocates and the HMP Collective. You can sign up for updates through healthnotprisons.org, as well as the PWN Policy Fellows and follow along on our socials at PWN_USA for more updates, or to sign up and register for more policy training similar to the ones that we are putting on today. Really quickly, wanted to go over the learning objectives for today. So we are going, after this training, we will have learned the basics of advocating with administrative agencies. We will have learned key strategies for engaging in administrative advocacy. We'll have learned the basics of the federal legislative process, and we'll also have learned key strategies for engaging in legislative advocacy as well. for logistics and agreements today. Wanted to give you all a heads up that we are recording and live streaming. Live streaming to our PW on Facebook. So if you need to, for whatever reason, change your name to a pseudonym on Zoom for privacy reasons or anything, please feel free to do so. But if you're comfortable, please share your name, pronouns, and location if you haven't already in the chat. Wanted to also mention that this is a learning space for all of us, right? So there are no dumb questions. We want you to be able to ask any questions that come up for you, share your experiences as you are comfortable. Know that this is, again, a learning space for our PWN policy fellows, our H&P advocates, and our PWN members and community. Today, our panelists actually are asking folks to save their questions until the end of the presentation so that they can get through all of the content. And then if you have any questions, we will have a dedicated time at the end to go over all those questions. So feel free to put your questions in the chat, and I will have a running document to keep track of them as they come in. And then we'll also have folks, if they, during the Q&A portion, raise their hand and go off mute if they want to ask their question off mute. So yes, that's just some logistics for today. And with that, I'm very excited to present our presenters for today. We have Ronald Johnson. Ronald uses he, him pronouns, and he is the chair of the U.S. People Living with HIV Caucus. Ronald has been an amazing partner and co-conspirator to PWN, and we're just so excited to have him share his expertise with us. We also have Lucie, who uses she, her, and AI pronouns. She's the senior policy analyst at the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Justice. And so we're really excited to have Lucie on as a partner to share her knowledge. Lucie was also an IFWN Health Fellow as well, similar to me in the past. So it's really nice to have Lucie on today to share with us. So welcome to Ronald and Lucie. Feel free to add an emoji or welcome them in the chat. We're just so thrilled and grateful to have you both here with us sharing. Awesome. And before I hand it off to Ronald, I wanted to give a quick grounding on federal administrative advocacy versus legislative advocacy, right? Because we're covering these two types of advocacies. And I wanted to, provide us a quick grounding on the key differences really between the two. And LaShonda, actually, I see your hand before I go into the slide really fast. Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I hit it by accident.
Oh, no worries. Okay, that's good. Alrighty, so for legislative advocacy, right? Legislative advocacy is what I think many of y'all as advocates and fellows are somewhat familiar with already based off of your applications to the programs. This is advocacy that happens on the federal level at Congress or at the state level within your state legislatures, right? So during last month's training, we went over the three branches of government, including the legislative branch, right? So the legislative branch on the federal level is Congress. And so legislative advocacy primarily happens during the time that a bill is introduced into Congress and then is passed in Congress. And so you're really advocating towards congressional staff and lawmakers, your US congressmen. And what you advocate and how you advocate is also through a variety of ways, including meetings with your legislators or their staff people, sharing information. And this includes not only just memos and briefs, but also communications and storytelling, right? Sharing your experiences and how this law or bill would make a difference or impact you or your community. And the goal, right, is favorable legislation, usually if you're trying to push forward proactive legislation, but sometimes that also means opposing bad legislation as well. It's oftentimes actually easier to oppose bills, I would say, than to actually pass a bill, right? Because it's easy to point out the negatives or even just argue that there's not enough money, right, for a bill, right? So oftentimes opposing a bill sometimes is a little easier than passing a bill. Administrative advocacy. So this is different than legislative advocacies in a lot of ways, because this is usually what happens after a bill becomes law, right? After you pass a bill and you do all the hard work, the implementation part is also oftentimes like the hardest part of passing a law, right? It's how a law is implemented and ensuring that the goals and what you pass the law for actually makes a difference in our communities and for the people we are pushing the law forward for, right? So you would advocate at federal administrative offices, or if at the state level, your state administrative offices, which Ronald will go ahead, will do a deeper dive into what exactly those offices, for example, are. You'll advocate through meetings, sharing information, and then importantly, commenting. So there's actually like a dedicated system to comment around how agencies are implementing the law. And Ronald will also go over that. And who you meet with, right, is different. Instead of legislators and their staff people, you're meeting with federal employees. Oftentimes, it's hard to find out who those actual federal employees are that are impacting the laws or the policies that you want to change or influence, right? But they're just kind of, regular federal employees and within this large system. So that's who you meet with. And your goal is to create favorable regulations, rules, letters, executive orders, guidance, a lot of different types of policies that administrative offices create or I guess are in charge of creating. So yeah, those are just some key differences. And a shout out to Lucie for sharing this amazing slide and the chart with the differences between legislative and administrative advocacy. So again, I will go ahead and pass it over to Ronald to go over federal administrative advocacy. And just another quick reminder that we'll be doing questions at the end of today's session. So please feel free to write down your questions to ask off mute at the end, or put your questions in the chat and I'll do my best to log them to ask at the end towards the Q&A portion. So I'll go ahead and pass it along to Ronald. Oh, you're on mute, Ronald.
3 years of Zoom calls and I still can't unmute myself. My apologies to everyone. And again, thank you, Amanda, for that opening and beginning to ground us in terms of both legislative advocacy and administrative advocacy. Next slide. I want to further ground us and to start by looking at what is public policy. Public policy is one of those terms that we use many, many times. We hear it. We all think we know what it is. Many of us do know what it is, but it is one of those terms that if you have 5 public policy experts, you might have 5 or 6 different variations on the theme of what is public policy. Boiling all of that down into a pretty much generic definition. Public policy are the set of actions that governments adopt and pursue to address problems or issues, usually problems that are prominent or well-known or issues that are before it. And policies are what a government chooses to do about an issue or problem, but they are also what a government body chooses not to do. And I think we need to recognize, particularly as we talk about administrative advocacy, that inaction or ignoring an issue or problem can itself be a form of public policy. They are choosing to ignore an issue. They are choosing to not address it. So it's the assertive decision about, yes, we are doing this, this is our policy, this is what's guiding us, or probably more silent, that it what they don't do. And the public policies can take the form of laws, regulations, rules, and other things that I'll talk a little bit more as we go along. The other important thing that I want to talk about, mention in terms of public policy, it affects many aspects of our lives. Sometimes we don't always realize to what extent public policies, the actions that government takes, really do influence so many parts of our lives. So looking in at what is federal administrative advocacy, and that really becomes, and again, this is pretty much of a generic definition, it's the process of influencing and shaping or opposing policies, that is rules, regulations, again, the set of actions that governments take, that federal offices, departments, and agencies adopt to implement laws or otherwise carry out their statutory and constitutional duties. And it's important, I think, to point out that these policies are authorized, and they're authorized by laws, which we'll be talking about later in this webinar, and also what their constitutional duties are, what they are supposed to do. And advocacy around that is achieved through engagement with the various federal bodies. Next slide. So what are those bodies? What are those departments? And when we are focusing on HIV and AIDS, there are many agencies and departments that impact HIV policies. Here are some of them, and the major ones. In the Office of the President, you have the Office of National AIDS Policy, ONAP, the current director of which is Harold Phillips. Oh, senior moment there, Harold Phillips. Some of the major departments, certainly, and probably foremost, Department of Health and Human Services, and within the Department of Health and Human Services, you have CMS, which is the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Put in the Administration of Community Living. That is not always associated with HIV/AIDS, but why is it important? It's an agency that administers the Older Americans Act, and over 50% of people living with HIV are 50 years and older. And as we approach and get to 2030, it's projected that over 70% of people living with HIV are going to be 50 years or older. So more and more, the Older Americans Act, and specifically the Administration for Community Living, is going to be playing, and is playing, and will be playing an important role in terms of HIV policies and what affects people living with HIV, they need to be on the radar screen of our administrative advocacy. The Social Services Administration, which oversees disabilities, Social Security, the Department of Housing, HUD, Housing Development, which oversees the HOPWA program, and the Department of Justice. And it's important to cite there because when we talk about HIV criminalization and how to change some of the policies that impact and criminalize people living with HIV and changing that, it's not just the legislation that we need to look at, but what is the Department of Justice doing? How can they influence states to get rid of HIV criminalization laws? Next slide. Some of the major advisory bodies that affect HIV policies, and I think these are pretty much well known. The Presidential Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS, otherwise known as PACHA. And although it's a little less known, but still very, very important, the CDC HRSA Advisory Committee on HIV, viral hepatitis, and STD prevention and treatment, or CHAC. Next slide. Some of the key policies and the programs that really need to be part of the focus of our administrative advocacy. Certainly the National HIV/AIDS strategy, the Ending the HIV Epidemic in the United States, the Ryan White HIV/AIDS program, which includes ADAP, housing opportunities for persons with AIDS, HOPWA, CDC prevention policies and programs. Next slide. The Minority HIV/AIDS Fund, Medicare and Medicare, AIDS HIV research that is done out of the Office of AIDS Research and at the National Institutes of Health. As I mentioned, the Older Americans Act. And while many of us are domestic advocates, it's important to highlight the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, PEPFAR, because certainly what PEPFAR is doing and accomplishing around the world and how it operates needs to be, should be, has been part of what we do when we look at administrative advocacy. How do we get the PEPFAR program more effective? How do we get the Ryan White program? All of these are some of the targets, if you will, of our administrative advocacy and purview. Next slide. So when we look at administrative advocacy, what are we talking about? Who is going to be doing administrative advocacy? Certainly organizations can be advocates, and organizations can go and be engaging as an organization in with the various federal bodies and offices. Coalitions, getting people together, not necessarily an organization, but people coming together with a common goal and wanting to address those goals with federal offices. Networks or other interest groups, and individuals, and that means all of us. You can be involved in federal administrative advocacy. Next slide. And some of the tactics and how we achieve and how we accomplish administrative advocacy can be almost an endless list, but certainly looking at the most common and most used tactics, directly engaging with representatives of federal offices and agencies, meeting with them, talking with them, going to lunch, going to dinner, all of this ways of engaging directly with the officers and the representatives. And yes, for the past 3 years, that has been mostly via Zoom or phone calls. But now, as we get more and more back into an in-person world, we need to really look at the importance of sitting down and meeting with, developing a relationship with federal officials, talking them, letting them know you and you know them, so that you can be helping to advocate for things that are important to people living with HIV. Providing public testimony or at advisory council meetings. PACHA is an example of that. At every PACHA meeting, there's a public comment period. That's an opportunity for organizations, individuals to let the PACHA members know what is on their minds, to tell them what they, as a body, as an advisory body to the president, what they need to be doing. Submitting comments on proposed rules and regulations is another form, an important form of administrative advocacy. The way our system works, when an agency proposes a rule, it needs to be published, it needs to be announced, usually in the Federal Register, and there is a comment period. And it's an opportunity to express your support for that rule, to express any opposition to the rule, or to say, you need to do this, you need to tweak it this way. We have to, those comments really do work. And if an agency gets a lot of negative comments, they have pulled the rule back. If they get a lot of support, that encourages them to go forward with that rule. So submitting comments on proposed rules is a very important part of administrative advocacy. Organizing and holding public demonstrations. That is a powerful tool of bringing, helping to mobilize the larger community on an issue and bringing that issue to the attention of federal officials, carrying out public campaigns that not only increase the awareness of the community, but focus the community's attention and brings that attention to public officials, so that public officials know that there is a constituency out there that is in favor of the particular action. So that is public campaigns are a good way to demonstrate to officials that this is an important issue, that what they are doing on that has impact on our lives, and we need to have a say in how those policies are developed and what the content of those policies. Certainly, utilizing social media and the news media is an important tool and an important tactic that we have in our administrative advocacy. And also, yes, disruption is a tool, and sometimes it comes to that we have to disrupt the process in order to make our needs, our demands better known and part of the process. So these are some of the important ways in which administrative advocacy can be accomplished. Next slide. The goal of which, how to get involved in administrative advocacy is joining and attending meetings with local groups, the Ryan White planning councils, state planning councils, or all of these are, going to those meetings, and when there is a public comment period, submitting comments, making comments, joining an advisory body. Sometimes The process can be very obtuse, but many of those bodies they're not just government officials or staff, they are public members. So knowing what the process is of being appointed or joining an advisory body and attending the meeting, submitting comments, again, submitting comments on rules and regulations, and joining PWN, joining the HIV Caucus or another people living with HIV network is also an important part of how you can get involved. But the clear message is that we get involved. We need to be involved in administrative advocacy, as well as we'll be talking about later, legislative advocacy. Next slide. Because the goals of this advocacy is to influence the decision-making process of administrative agencies and to influence them to ensure that the federal policies and programs align with the interests and concerns of people living with HIV and individuals, organizations, and communities that are impacted by HIV. Advocacy is very much part of the process of policy making, and our role in that needs to be taken seriously by ourselves. We are players in this field. And also to remember that public policies are made by real people. I know we're talking about entering an era of artificial intelligence and chat box, but these policies are deliberately made by people. And it is we, and the phrase is not just a patriotic soundbite, it's we the people, you are part of the process, and we as people can affect the people who make decisions. And it's our responsibility, I would say, that in whatever form it takes, some of us are very adept at sitting down and talking directly and engaging and arguing and influencing a government official. Some of us are great at writing statements and getting it on social media. There are many tactics, as we just reviewed, I tried to highlight. There are many ways in which we can accomplish administrative advocacy. You can find your niche in the process of advocacy and administrative advocacy, because these policies affect our lives, whether we are our lives as people living with HIV, allies, people directly affected, all of that. Policies affect our lives. Policies are made by people and decisions, and it is our ability. We need to seize the ability to influence that process, to make sure, as I said, that those policies align with our interests. We see so many examples of when policies do not align with our interests and what we know is right for our lives. So that is why we have the ability to influence those decisions, those policies, by working directly with federal bodies or commenting to them. We need to seize and take advantage of what we can do and to achieve administrative policy, to make sure that, again, policies align with our interests. And I'm hopeful that throughout the discussion, we'll have more opportunity to talk about ways in which we can influence administrative policies. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ronald. And that was super powerful. I really appreciate it. And yeah, we're looking forward to asking you questions at the end of the presentation as well around, we have a few great questions already coming in through the chat. But in the meantime, before we go over to Lucie, we wanted to do a quick check-in with everyone, just based on Ronald's presentation. What is one federal administrative agency you're interested in learning more about? Or it could be a program Ronald mentioned. Is there a particular agency you're interested in learning more about? Please feel free to drop it in the chat or come off mute and share. Also, if you have any experience around administrative advocacy, would love to hear it. So feel free to, oh yeah, a lot of PACHA. Folks are interested in PACHA. That's great. We definitely have ways to plug you into commenting around PACHA. So I'm very excited to hear that. LaShonda said Ryan White. Awesome. Any other programs, agencies y'all are interested in?
I'm interested in the Older Americans Act, which has an open comment period now. And it's very important, especially those who are under the older American age, 62, 65, to comment that people living with HIV need to be a special priority population and state we age earlier, even younger than 50. They need to be considered in the Older Americans Act, because now that HIV is a manageable chronic disease, it's no longer considered like a disability. But disability is also in the Older Americans Act. So we have to be clear and explain this in our comments.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Melanie, because I was holding that as an example for our discussion, as a current example of what we can do. And I hope we do have time at the end, because as you said, there is a public comment period that is now open on a very, very important issue, and we have an opportunity to weigh in. So hopefully I can talk more about what we can do in the later discussion. Thank you, Melanie.
Awesome, wonderful. And Brielle, I see you. Go ahead.
Yes, I would like to work with Ryan White, because I feel as if Ryan White, yes, Ryan White is a good source, but I don't think that Ryan White, well, I can speak for here in Houston, it's being used to its fullest potential as far as helping those all that qualify for it, because particularly like the clinic I go to, which is AIDS Healthcare Foundation, they have non-medical case management there and medical case management. But for the non-medical case management, they don't have housing. And a lot of organizations says that they provide housing for people of trans experience, but a lot of the funds are barely going towards that. And I'm one that is affected by that, and one who have experienced that. It was so hard to get assistance before I transitioned. It was so easy. And so that's why I feel like that would be more helpful, where more facilities can provide housing.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know housing is a huge issue. And I love that you identified the Ryan White program, Brielle. Yeah, those are really great points. And we have folks agreeing in the chat. Yeah, completely, Kenya. Housing is a human right. Some other, yep, a lot of folks agree. Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Brielle. Okay, great. Well, that was awesome. We'll go ahead, and I'm excited to hear y'all mention all of these important agencies and programs, including PACHA, Ryan White. I see the DOJ, the Department of Justice. Yeah, that's amazing. And thank you so much, Melanie, for your comments as well. Yeah, excited to get into that more as later during the Q&A. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Lucie, who is going to go over federal legislative advocacy. And after her portion, we'll go into Q&A. So keep on putting your questions in the chat, and I'll go ahead and do my best to keep track of them. I'll put a little green check mark next to the question once I've logged it. All right, go ahead, Lucie. Thank you so much.
Of course. Thank you so much, Amanda. And thank you to everybody that is on the call today. Ronald, thank you for that incredible overview of administrative advocacy. It is such an honor and a joy to get to share space with the folks on the call today. This is my first time joining a PWN call, and I can already, the power of the folks that are in this space is already incredibly palpable. So I just want to say thank you for everyone that's taking the time to join this. I know these aren't necessarily the most interesting topics. They're not the sexiest topics, but they are the topics that are going to give us the tools that we need to utilize our power to make sure that our elected officials are listening to us on the issues that matter to us. And so with that being said, we are going to stay on this slide for just a moment so that I can ground this conversation about federal legislative advocacy and about what does that really mean. So, as Ronald said, if administrative advocacy is the process of influencing the decision makers of administrative agencies, then legislative advocacy is the influencing of our legislative process, of our members of Congress, also known as lobbying. So you're going to hear legislative advocacy often referred to as lobbying because that is how it's formally that's its formal term. So lobbying in its simple form is asking a member of Congress to do something, to change something, or to stop something using the power of their office. So when we're talking about federal legislative advocacy, or advocacy at the federal level, when lobbying, we're focusing on the legislative branch of our government, which I know a lot of folks on the call are already really well versed on given the last training. So I will just go over it very briefly. But when we're talking about the legislative branch, when we're talking about Congress, there's two chambers that make up Congress. And so that's the House and the Senate. The Senate, the makeup of both the House and Senate, as well as their responsibilities, are dictated by Article 1 of our United States Constitution at the federal level. So the Senate is made up of 100 senators, 2 from each state, and the House is made up of 435 representatives, with each state having a different number based on the population of that state. That is determined through a process known as apportionment, which is based or tied to the census. So that's why we have a process for counting individuals for the purpose of apportioning the amount of representatives as dictated under Article 1 of the United States Constitution, in case anybody is wondering, why do we do it this way? So when we're talking about lobbying and we're asking members of Congress to utilize their power, what does that mean? What is their power? What is the responsibilities of Congress? Again, defined within Article 1, the responsibilities of Congress is to make and pass federal law, to determine federal tax guidelines. They have the power to declare war. They can propose changes to the Constitution. They also are responsible for allocating money to federal programs in the yearly budget and ensuring that our government continues to, have a budget and have enough money to function. And then finally, the Senate has the unique authority to approve presidential appointments, including to SCOTUS and their own executive cabinet, which then influences agencies. So when we think, and what we'll really be focused on today in federal legislative advocacy is lobbying on bills. So lobbying for federal legislation that supports communities affected by and living with HIV and AIDS, joining lobby visits with members of Congress, sharing stories from communities that are directly impacted, or uplifting petitions and letter writing campaigns supporting a particular policy or supporting policies that are in line with the values of individuals that are affected by and living with HIV and AIDS. But it can also look like when we're talking about engaging with members of Congress, it can talk about, we can talk about influencing members of our appropriations committee. So making sure that we're allocating money to programs that support communities living with and affected by HIV. It also can be engaging in the judicial nominations process, which has been I feel like, especially since the Trump administration, a huge deal, because we're getting, especially under the Trump administration, an influx of judges that are adhering to a particular political mindset. And so engaging with Congress can also be engaging in the judicial nominations process to make sure that candidates that promote terrible things like refusing PrEP for religious or moral reasons, which we have seen, case law and precedent set that those kinds of candidates don't make it to the bench. And all of that happens when we're engaging with Congress. But on this next slide, we're really going to get into the nitty gritty of what is the quintessential form of legislative advocacy that really comes to mind. And that's moving a bill from introduction to passage. And we have a video from Schoolhouse Rock that will show just a really quick clip of.
Whew, you sure gotta climb a lot of steps to get to this Capitol building here in Washington. Well, I wonder who that sad little scrap of paper is.
I'm just a bill, yes, I'm only a bill, and I'm sitting here on Capitol Hill. Well, it's a long, long journey to the capital city. It's a long, long wait while I'm sitting in committee, but I know I'll be a law someday. At least I hope and pray that I will, but today I am still just a bill.
Gee, Bill, you certainly have a lot of patience and courage.
Well, I got this far. When I started, I wasn't even a bill. I was just an idea. Some folks back home decided they wanted a law passed, so they called their local congressman, and he said, "You're right, there ought to be a law." Then he sat down and wrote me out and introduced me to Congress, and I became a bill.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Amanda. I wish we could watch the whole thing and that we had time for the whole thing because it is such a fun video. It does show in such an effective and succinct way the way that bills are supposed to move through our legislative process. It's the quintessential version of what we all think about when we think about what is the legislative process. And then today we're really going to be getting into what are the tactics of engaging in that process? What are the levers of opportunity that you have as an advocate? And how can you, even if you don't get from start to finish, from introduction to passage, how can you leverage that to your benefit and for the communities that you represent? So on this slide, you'll notice right at the top that there is a basic structure of how a bill is supposed to move through the legislative process. And it does seem simple in theory, which is just introduction, committee consideration, House vote, reconciliation with the Senate bill, and then president's signature. So before we get into really breaking down that process step by step, it's important to note that only 5% of bills, and I think it was the 117th Congress, is the last one we had data on, actually make it through that process each legislative session. So that's 400 of over 10,000 bills in the 117th Congress actually made it through that process. So less than 5% actually get all the way to the end, but it isn't, bill passage isn't the only sign of success for a bill. And we'll kind of break that down and what that looks like and how you can continue to leverage that for power for the communities that you represent. So when we're talking about, I just mentioned 117th Congress. So at the federal level, the legislative calendar is divided into 2-year-long sessions every Congress. So we are currently in the 118th Congress. So we started counting in 1789, and every 2 years we count a new Congress. So currently in 2023, that puts us in the 118th Congress. The makeup of Congress right now in this current year, as folks already know, we're incredibly politically divided, both as a country and a Congress. We have razor thin margins with a Republican majority in the House. That's 222 Republican members versus 213 Democratic members, and then a Democratic majority in the Senate with 49 Republican members and 48 Democratic members, but 3 independents that caucus with Democrats. So very thin in terms of a majority in both the House and Senate. So getting things passed in a Congress like the 118th Congress is, speaking to political analysts and things like that, is just not going to happen by all accounts. From what we're hearing from folks, things have been moving, but anything that is quote unquote controversial, which tends to be things that impact the communities that we represent, are unlikely to move in this Congress. But we can talk about what does it look like to build support in a Congress where things aren't likely to move. But breaking it all the way back down into just step-by-step process, we're at step 1. what does it look like to just get a bill introduced? So the very first step is you need a representative to sponsor the bill. So this is your champion on the Hill. This is a representative or a senator that is values aligned with you, that is aligned with you on this particular policy, that believes in it enough to push it forward, to get it drafted and introduced. And that even that in and of itself sounds simple. Drafting requires a lot of back and forth with attorneys that are experienced in legislative drafting. They're called legislative counsel, as well as advocacy organizations that help to craft a bill that is truly accomplishing what they want it to accomplish, depending on what policy they're putting forward. So again, an important part of that process that is often overlooked is finding the right champion for your cause and for your bill. So what does it mean to be the right champion? Of course, it means to be values aligned with you, but it also means what is their committee membership? What is their caucus membership? How long have they been on the Hill? What does their leadership look like on the Hill? Is this a member that has the capacity to be your champion on the Hill, to make sure that your bill doesn't die in committee or doesn't get forgotten about on the Hill? So there's a couple of different factors to look into when determining who to even go to with your bill. Coalition building is also incredibly important at this stage because it can help build support for your bill. It can help whip original co-sponsors. And so the sponsor of your bill is the introducing member or members. The original co-sponsors are the other members of Congress that have chosen to support your bill ahead of introduction. So generally speaking, a high number of original co-sponsors at the time of introduction is what you're going for, because you want to show that your bill has broad support across multiple people. That doesn't mean that a bill that only has, let's say, 30 original co-sponsors isn't worth introducing, especially if that bill is a messaging bill. That is the Heal for Immigrant Families Act at one point, so I'll talk more about that. It isn't the end all be all, but original co-sponsorship is a good number or a good, data set to look at to determine how much support any particular bill has. So now you're at the first step done. You have your champion, the bill is drafted, it's actually introduced, you're assigned a bill number. What happens next is the bill is then assigned to a committee for study. So this is also known as a committee markup, where the committee will hold hearings, debate, vote, create reports for the House. And then if it's released by the committee, then the House will then put it on a calendar to vote on, debate, and amend. Again, fewer than 10% of bills actually make it out for consideration on the House floor or the Senate floor. If the committee chooses to table the bill and it fails to come up again at a later time for a vote, then that is what we call a bill dying. And I'm sorry for the really morose terminology there. That's the only way that I hear it talked about on the Hill. So if you hear that a bill has died, it means that it's been referred to committee and it isn't expected to get referred out for the House floor or the Senate floor. So this is a crucial phase in the legislative process and begs the question of what is a committee? Why do we have committees? Why are these important? So on the next slide, it breaks down what is a committee? What are the types of committee? Why are we using this in our legislative process? So a committee in Congress is a group of experts on specific topics chosen by their parties after each election. So through the House, for example, there are over 10,000 bills that get introduced in any given Congress, in 117th, 118th. I see the note for slowly. I will slow it down. I'm sorry, y'all. We have so much content to cover and so little time, but we'll slow it down. So the purpose of a committee is really to make sure that folks who understand the subject matter of a given bill are the first people to look at it, because bills of every variety, of every topic come through the House, come through the Senate. They want individuals who are experts on that specific bill to take a look at it first. So there are specific types of committee that serve separate purposes in Congress, with the House and Senate each having their own. So you'll notice here on the slide, there are 4 different types of committees: standing, select, joint, and conference. So for a standing committee, this is a committee that's going to continue from one Congress to the next. So the standing committees of the House in 118th Congress are the same as those for 117th Congress. These are the ones that are going to be most important for your legislative advocacy, because these are the committees that shape the vast majority of proposed laws. They conduct investigations. they are the committees that you want to whip members on. So if you have a bill, you look for your committee of jurisdiction, you whip members from that committee to up your co-sponsors, so that when you do get referred to a committee, you've already built a level of support within that committee for your bill or for your policy. Select committees are temporarily formed for specific purposes. So they usually don't draft legislation. A good example, a recent example that you might have heard of is the House Select Committee on the January 6th attack. So, the House put together a select committee of Congress to investigate, even though we all know what caused the January 6th attack, what was the January 6th attack, who was at fault, and then can move forward with in terms of accountability because of that select committee. So that's an example of what a select committee might do in Congress. A joint committee have similar purposes as select committees. So these are made up, the reason why it's called joint is they're made up of members from both houses or both chambers of Congress of both the House and Senate and conduct business between both chambers. They also help focus public attention on major issues. And then a conference. So the conference is created when House and Senate need to reconcile different versions of the same bill, which we'll talk about in more depth a little bit later. But conference committees, similarly to joint committees, are made up of both chambers of Congress. And so on the next slide, it breaks down even further. Again, the committees that we are most concerned with when we're engaging in federal legislative advocacy is our standing committees of Congress. So this outlines the standing committees for both the House and Senate. The reason why the standing committees are the most important for your advocacy are because this is going to be the committee that your bill is referred to first before being able to go to the House or Senate floor for a full vote. So for me, in my portfolio, I feel like I should have said this at the beginning, but Lucie Arvallo, she, her pronouns, senior policy analyst with the Latina Institute. The portfolio that I lead on is the Immigrant Access to Healthcare and Coverage portfolio. So to your question, Dawn, the committees that are most relevant to my bills, the Heal for Immigrant Families Act, or the bills within my policy portfolio, are the Energy and Commerce and the Ways and Means Committee, because those committees are tasked with really broad authority to review bills related to both health and social services. And then the health subcommittees within each of those committees are even more relevant for me based on the policy that I'm looking at. And so what standing committees are relevant, especially for you, are going to be determined by the bill that you're trying to push forward. And I'll show you a snippet from congress.gov in just a little bit to show you where you can find that information and to determine what standing committee is most relevant for you, which again is going to be determined by which policy that you're advocating at any given time. And so on the next slide, let's say your bill is one of the lucky ones. You've just been referred out of all of your committees of jurisdiction. Now what happens? So the bill is then read on the House floor. You have made it. Not a lot of bills make it to this place. This can be both a good and a bad thing, and I'll explain that. So at this point in the process, the bill is read on the House floor, debated, amendments are proposed, added, and then the House moves forward to a full vote, where then you'll get a formal count. You'll see it on C-SPAN, a certain amount of members said yay, certain amount of members said nay, and that determines whether or not it moves forward. It's done by something that's known as a simple majority. So you only need 218 representatives of the House of any party in order to move a bill forward. So the reason why this is both a good and a bad thing, a House vote, you would think you're moving a bill forward in the process. How could that possibly be bad? So at this moment, it's really critical, especially, we're talking about, in the good sense, we're moving forward a proactive bill that we want to see that will create good change on the ground. But more often than not, we're talking about a bad bill that has some kind of negative connotation for our communities, or is going to wreak havoc or cause additional harm. And so it's when you get to the floor of a House vote that you can start to really fundamentally alter and change bills. So you can add amendments to a bill that try to ameliorate some of the harm. You can take things out. So for example, if there is in a bill, a line that says clinics are allowed to, based on a religious or moral exemption, refuse to provide PrEP or services for those who are experiencing or living with HIV or AIDS. And that bill is then referenced for a House vote on the floor. you can, if you have a champion that is values aligned with you, then try to amend that bill to take that line out, so that even if the bill does pass, that the harmful aspect of the bill can come out. So that can work against you as well. So if you have a good proactive bill that you're wanting to move forward, the opposition can then use this opportunity to add bad amendments, to change your language, or to take away some of the things that you've been working for. So again, both good and bad. We'll stick with the good line and be optimistic. We'll go to the next slide. So let's say it's a good vote. You're on the House floor, you pass by simple majority. Now you're moving to the Senate. So we're in the Senate, the bill, so we now have the bills pass the House. Now it's going for deliberation in the Senate. And so it's functionally the same process. So unless a companion bill has already been introduced in the Senate, which happens, bicameral introduction definitely happens in both chambers. If that isn't the case, that means the bill is again assigned a committee within the Senate, and if released, debated and voted on. So it has to go through the full legislative process again, but on the Senate side. So then the good, if the Senate passes a bill after a full vote, and there are no differences, then you don't need to go any further. That bill can then go to the president's desk for signature. What happens more often than that, though, is the House and Senate pass the bill, but those bills look different. So if the Senate passes the bill after a full vote and there are differences between the version that passed the Senate and the one that passed the House, then the bill has to go through the reconciliation and concurrence process in a conference committee where people from both chambers will try to maintain their own versions, reach compromise, and essentially prepare a written conference report that's submitted to each chamber. And that conference report has to be approved by both the House and Senate for final approval. So the legislative text, the bill text, has to be approved again by both the House and Senate. So let's assume we're there, right? Now we've gone through the full House vote, the full Senate vote. Now we have a bill that looks the same, has passed both chambers. You are the unicorn bill that has made it all the way through. Are you law yet? And the answer is no. So on the next slide, we go through that final process, which is the president's signature. So after a measure has been passed in identical form by both the House and Senate, it is considered enrolled. So the enrolled bill is then sent to the president, who may sign the measure into law, veto it, and return it to Congress, let it become law without signature, or at the end of a session, pocket veto it. So again, those are a couple of different options the president can do with a bill that's an enrolled bill that's been passed through both the House and Senate. So they can either sign it into law just immediately. Once they sign the bill, then it's law. They can let it pass into law without their signature. So that means that the Congress is still in session, more than 10 days has passed, and the president still hasn't signed. It automatically becomes law. If Congress adjourns before the 10 days and the president has not signed the bill, then it does not become law, and that's known as a pocket veto. And the other way that the president can veto it outside of that pocket veto is just an outright veto, which just means the president says, I don't agree with this. It's sent back to Congress. Congress then has two options. They can either change the bill based on whatever it is that the president has issue with, or they can try to override that veto by a 2/3 vote of those present. So if the veto of the bill is overridden in both chambers, then it becomes law without the president's signature. And so that's finally, how does a bill become law? And so now that we've gone through the entire thing, you can understand why the schoolhouse rock song does not do justice to how very difficult it is in this country to actually get a bill passed from start to finish. But we can talk about, and we have an actual example, a concrete example of what does this process look like? How can you use those different levers of power to your advantage? So on the slide that has congress.gov, Amanda, I think it's just, yeah, there we go. So how do you use all this information about the legislative process in your own advocacy? What does this mean for the bills that matter for you? So congress.gov is an incredible tool that you can use to find policies that matter to you that have been introduced in 118th Congress. You can search and filter by subject matter, by introducing member, by year, by legislative session. And yes, all the love for Representative Barbara Lee. She's an incredible champion. And so this here is a specific example from 117th Congress. This is HR 1305, Repeal HIV Discrimination Act of 2021, introduced by the venerable Representative Barbara Lee, who is incredible. So what you will see on this landing page for this particular bill, or any bill that you'll pull up, congress.gov will tell you what congressional session you're in, or what congressional session was the last one this bill was introduced, where the bill is at in the legislative process. So it'll tell you if it's been introduced formally, what subcommittee it was referred to, what committee it's in, what committees of jurisdiction are relevant, what order the subcommittees will be conducting their review, how many co-sponsors does the bill have, how many of those co-sponsors are original co-sponsors. It'll also include text, summary, related bills, and a summary of actions already taken on the bill. So this is going to be really your first stop for, federal legislative advocacy and getting an idea of where your bill is at, or what bill you want to be lobbying for, or what bills align with you. And then from there, you can start to build out your strategy of how to increase co-sponsorship or to engage in advocacy for that particular bill. And so for this particular bill, you can use that information to identify relevant committees to target. But one thing we haven't talked about is additionally caucuses that you can target. So committees are a part of Congress. The members of each of those committees are determined formally in congressional session. For caucuses, any member of Congress can join the caucuses, generally speaking, that they want to join, and aren't determined by election or appointment the same way committees are. So Representative Barbara Lee is a good example, as she's the co-chair to the Joint Congressional Caucus on HIV/AIDS. So again, if there is a policy that you want to move forward, Representative Barbara Lee is an incredible place to start with that, because of her championship in the Congressional Caucus on HIV and AIDS, in addition to her established leadership on the Hill, her committee membership, her longstanding tenure, and all of the other things that make Rep. Barbara Lee incredible. So on the next slide, almost done, y'all. Check-in question. So that was a lot of information. And before I jump into a more concrete example of, how this looks in my portfolio, a bill that I work on, and how I am currently, what tactics I'm utilizing to move that bill forward, I want to hear from folks on, what is one bill in Congress that you would like to see introduced or passed? And please feel free either to share that in the chat or to come off of mute. I would be happy to hear from folks, and this can be something that's already in Congress, or just something that you would love to see introduced in Congress if it hasn't already been. Yeah, and I'm not able to see the name of the individual that just raised their hand, but please feel free to come off of mute.
It's me, Brielle.
Hi.
Yes, so I would like to see more laws that is in favor of people of the LGBTQ community and people of trans experience, because yes, society have changed and things have got better, and also society have learned to tolerate homosexuality, but it's still a level of stigma and judgmental out there when it comes to trans and gender changing. So I would like to see more laws that are in favor for us than against us, like our current Texas government is trying to continue to do, because a lot of people don't realize, I never realized it until I actually became trans, how hard it is being a trans woman or a trans man and trying to live a normal life without stigma or without being denied the basic things that you need to continue to push forward in life. And people do it all the time indirectly. And trust me, I face it left to right. But I
you.
don't let it discourage me. I pick up and keep on pushing.
Brielle, thank you so much for sharing. There's so much power and just and vulnerability in sharing your story. And I know that's not always easy, especially in this moment. I am joining this training from Texas. So I was born and raised in Texas. And right now we've had an onslaught of anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ bills that were passed in our legislative session. There were over 300, I think, nationwide that were either introduced in state legislative sessions or at the federal level just alone in the last 2 or 3 years. So that's definitely something that we are going to continue to be pushing forward at the Latina Institute. There is a strong coalition of folks pushing forward bills that center trans communities, that fight for trans communities and make sure that trans communities continue to live in safety. So thank you so much for sharing. And thank you to everybody that's dropped their additional bills in the chat. Like I said, it's just such an honor to be in power with the folks that have joined this call, and such a great segue into, the fight for reproductive justice. And so as we know, and on the next slide, Amanda, it'll go over how intersectional the fight for reproductive justice really is. And so for folks that are not familiar with reproductive justice as a framework or that are being introduced to it for the first time now, reproductive justice is a human rights framework, an intersectional human rights framework created by Black women that states that every individual has the human right to determine if, when, and how to create a family and to sustain that family in a safe environment. And so fighting for reproductive justice means inclusion of all individuals, regardless of their geographic location, regardless of their age, their sex, their gender identity, their sexual orientation, their immigration status, their HIV status, and is making sure that we are all, because our oppression is intersectional, our fight against the systems that seek to oppress us is also intersectional. And so that's the framework that we utilize at the Latina Institute. And again, one in my portfolio that I really center is ensuring that individuals understand both on the Hill, at the partner level, and a grassroots level that reproductive justice fundamentally is immigrant justice. I am a third-generation Mexican-American, which means that my family immigrated to this country from Sonora, Mexico. Immigrant justice is something that is near and dear to my heart, to my identity. And so what does that mean? From approaching policy from a values-based framework, that means that we're starting from a place that says all of us of every documentation status should have access to the full range of reproductive healthcare options so that we can take care of ourselves and our families with dignity. What does that mean in terms of a policy framework? That means that we need policies that support our whole lives, including better access to hospitals and clinics, healthcare provided by people our communities trust, and insurance that covers our real needs, a path to citizenship, and policies that support families and individuals to thrive, like the Heal for Immigrant Families Act. And so the next slide really goes into what that policy is, what that policy looks like. And so for us, it's important starting from that values-based place of not starting from a politically minded place when we talk about policy, because it isn't often the politically minded conversations that actually bring justice to our communities. It's when we're in a place where we feel safe to dream that we then create policies that are inclusive of all of our communities. So just one more slide, Amanda. And so this is what is the Health Equity and Access Under Law Act for Immigrant Families. So this is what I focus on. This is, I'm trying to move this bill from introduction to passage. So this would remove the 5-year waiting period in Medicaid and CHIP, open up the ACA marketplace, expand access to Medicare, so that immigrants can access the affordable health care they need. So you have your values, where you want to start, but how do you implement that into policy? Well, first, you need to know what legal and policy barriers you want to address or have an idea of what policies you want to see implemented. HEAL was really built out of a failure of the conversations of comprehensive immigration reform, of immigrants being left out of the Affordable Care Act conversations. So we knew what policy barriers we wanted to get rid of. It was those barriers that prevent immigrant communities from accessing insurance. So then you find a champion that aligns with your values on the Hill. So for HEAL, that's Representative Pramila Jayapal and Senator Cory Booker, who have been introducing members for 2 Congresses. So you have your champion, you have your bill, but how do you build support? So you build that support by creating a coalition of both organizations and individuals that can help you build power on the ground for your bill, whether it's joining those lobby visits, writing those letters, engaging in the social media campaigns, the real true power of legislative advocacy comes from centering directly impacted communities and uplifting those voices. And that's really what's going to take you over the line of getting members of Congress to support directly with their constituents, with members of their district. And those are the kinds of tactics we use to bring up HEAL specifically from 22 original co-sponsors and 116th to 77 original co-sponsors and 117th, and are prepping for introduction bicamerally and 118th Congress. So that's just one example of how we put those values into practice at Latina Institute. And I know we've got a little bit over, so I'm so sorry, Amanda, but I will end there.
No, thank you so much, Lucie. You covered so much in such a short amount of time. And I hear definitely some folks wanting to like unpack all of this because it is so much content. And so I appreciate folks acknowledging that, as well as some language justice needs as well, which we will discuss as well, and how we can incorporate that better in the future. So thank you all for being so active in the chat, and thank you, Lucie, so much for breaking it down in such a concise and thorough way that really is reflective of the process in such a quick way as well. So we really appreciate it. It's also, thank you so much for your leadership on the HEAL Act. I think I was especially excited to hear about the work that the Latina Institute is doing on a federal level and with federal legislation for immigrant justice and immigrant families. So I was especially excited for you bringing in that example. And again, so grateful for your leadership. So yeah, with that, we'll go ahead and go into the Q&A portion. So I have a list of questions, and folks can feel free to raise their hand, and we'll be added to the queue. And then I also have a list of questions that I've compiled from the chat that we'll also try to get through. I know we only have about 14 minutes left with y'all, so we'll try to get through everything as soon as possible. But I see, Kameen, your hand is up.
Hey everybody. So I wanted to first say thank you to both of the presenters today. The first administrative piece was very informative, and I think it was because he was a little older, a little bit more seasoned. I was able to catch all of it. I think the second one, she was very articulate and she did an amazing job, but it was like she was giving us so much information, and I was like, oh, I want to remember this, I want to know it. And it's just like some of it was just rolling out of my brain. But anyway, so I have two questions. One question is, well, the first question is, does policy need to be, does policy need to be thoroughly critiqued from both sides as much as possible regarding implementing solid policies? So like if I wanted to present a policy to someone, should I critique my own policy? Like, should I be like, let me look at this from both sides and like see what both sides are going to say in order for it to be a solid policy? And the other question that I wanted to ask was, did the CDC, HOPWA, and HRSA receive the power that they have in our community? Were they installed through policy? That was my second question.
Good question.
If Amanda, if I can address the first question, because I think that raises a very good point on the kind of homework we do as we develop our advocacy positions, and the degree to which how we want to frame them. I think in one sense, as advocates, we are focused or can focus on one position, and we can push that. we don't need to consider the other side, and we need to, and it is part of our job as advocate to push forward our position. Now, we also need to realize that the adoption of policy does take place in the real world, and that real world includes the politics of an issue. So it can be a good approach to consider the other side of an issue and to shape your policy, your position, so that it addresses as many points as possible in order to improve the chances of it being adopted. These are the kinds of strategic decisions that we need to make, and you'd almost do it on a case-by-case basis. I can't say one approach is going to fit all issues. But it's important, I think, your question raises some important points. That first, we are advocates and we don't need to apologize for being focused on our view and getting that view across. We also need to live in the real world. So we need to, at the same time, consider, how do I shape my position so that it increases the chances of it being adopted? So again, there's no simple, this way is the only way. I would cite, for an example, the many years it took for us to get rid of the ban on syringe exchange. That amendment was part of the appropriations bill year after year. It took hard work and advocacy, and our focus was on this rule, this ban needs to be overturned. I don't want to hear the other argument, the other side. This ban needs to be overturned year after year after year, and boom, it was overturned. So there are many ways to achieve both our administrative and legislative advocacy. Your question really shows the importance that we need to think out our strategies.
Yeah, and I would completely agree with that, Ronald. I think that in order to move forward our policies, and depending on which policy that is, you don't need to necessarily take into consideration opposing positions when that opposing position is directly undermining your humanity. So for examples that are in my portfolio, we're talking a lot about abortion policy, we're talking a lot about health access for immigrant communities. So when your opposition is saying things like certain human beings are less entitled to determining their bodily autonomy or to having access to healthcare, you don't necessarily need to take that into consideration when crafting your own position. But like Ronald mentioned, you do need to be aware of it so that then you know how to combat it. So if you're in a hearing, you understand what the opposition is going to say, and you can pivot your messaging out of it, and so that you're prepared for those attacks, but you aren't adjusting your position based on the opposition, especially when the opposition is fundamentally determined to see you as less than human. And that is dependent on what policies we're talking about and what the political concerns are for that particular policy.
Thank you. And I just want to make sure that, Kaneem, your second question, could you repeat your second question really fast for the presenters? I'm sorry.
Okay. My second question was, did the CDC, HOPWA, HRSA originally, were they conceived out of the power of installed policy?
That might be a good question. Ronald, do you?
Yeah, I didn't hear quite that last part of
Did
your
the
question.
okay, so it's, did the CDC, HOPWA, and HRSA originate out of the power or impact of installed policy?
Oh, okay. I think I understand it. So is it, I think the question is where, how, like who appoints folks to those agencies? How did they come to be?
No, yeah,
Oh,
yeah. How did they become like the standard for we how we navigate, as people living with HIV? Like, what gives them their power? Like, how were they appointed, into power? Was it the people creating policy, or did the government just say we're giving them this? Like, how did that happen?
Yeah, I think let's take HOPWA as one example. HOPWA that program was developed and came into place by legislation, a bill.
Okay.
And that was introduced. And I think it was part of, again, the advocates who were saying that housing was the number, and in many ways still is, the number one non-medical need of people living with HIV. And this is going back to the early 90s, when we were telling members of Congress that housing is a critical need. This was soon after the Ryan White program was developed. And to deal with the primarily the medical needs, and advocates and working with getting the ear of friendly Congress people. I'm blanking on the original sponsors of the HOPWA legislation, but I know the process of working with those offices and convincing them that we need a federal program that addresses the housing needs. So that's became the HOPWA the law that developed and authorized the HOPWA program. Is one example of that, of how it came about. Similarly with the Ryan White program itself, just seeing the medical needs that were being neglected, and certainly having the symbolic figure of Ryan White and his testimony to Congress, and getting the attention and capturing the attention of Senator Hatch, Senator Kennedy, and some of the early supporters of the Ryan White program, and they drove it through Congress, and that the initial Ryan White bill passed overwhelmingly in both houses. So for the Ryan White and HOPWA, our advocacy helped to bring that around, and the legislative advocacy of meeting with Congress people, senators and representatives who said, yes, this is important, we'll sponsor it.
Don't forget Barbara Mikulski. She was a great champion, and my heart broke when she retired, because she was there from the beginning. And she sat on the Appropriations Committee, which was another plus. So, oh well.
And I will, sorry, Amanda, I will just add to what Ronald mentioned. The reasoning behind that particular agency is actually the same reasoning behind all administrative agencies. So the reason why administrative agencies are able to be promulgated is technically because Congress is delineating out their legislative authority. So every administrative agency and body has what's called an authorizing bill. So whether we're looking at HHS, DHS, that kind of thing, their power is designated to them from Congress and is supposed to remain within the parameters of their authorizing bill. So you can trace back any administrative agency to their authorizing bill to determine what are their responsibilities, what is the parameters of that agency supposed to be, and sometimes they're able to promulgate then their own agencies and studies, and that also determines how their budget is then appropriated through the legislative process. So they're technically getting delegated authority, congressional authority from Congress, and because of that need a authorizing bill attached to it.
And we saw a good example of exactly what Lucie said 2 weeks ago, or when the Supreme Court shot down President Biden's efforts to provide student relief, student loan relief. He did, that was an administrative action that he took, and the Supreme Court said, unwisely in my opinion, that it exceeded his authority, that he did not have congressional, it was not, his actions were not grounded in the legislation. So I think that was a good example of what Lucie just talked about. And yes, very unwisely.
Awesome. Thank you so much for those really amazing questions, Kaneen. And I know we are at time, so I just want to acknowledge that. And if anyone needs to jump, they should feel free. I wanted to share just quickly a couple slides before folks jump, and maybe we can just spend, I have 2 questions from the chat that I wanted to see if like the panelists afterwards could answer really quickly, and then we'll close out and I'll try to answer the other questions offline as well that we have. But really quickly, this is just part 1 of, or this is just a part of a series of trainings that we are hosting around policy advocacy. So we will be having 2 trainings around racial justice, key frameworks for conducting advocacy, including racial justice, as well as one on gender justice and reproductive justice in August. So please be on the lookout and join us for those. And then we have some continuing on in September, October, and November. So we're excited to keep on learning with y'all during these trainings, and we'll be bringing in expert panelists like Lucie and Ronald to these trainings. So wanted to put a plug in for that. And then next week we have, for PWN Policy Fellows, don't forget that we have our monthly mentor call on July 18th. And PWN is hiring for canvassers and phone bankers. If you are in Pennsylvania, Colorado, and Texas, we're looking for phone bankers. You can apply through the link here on the screen, the bit.ly link, or reach out if you have any other questions about that. And lastly, I just want everyone, if y'all don't mind giving a big round of applause, either through emojis or a thank you in the chat to Ronald and Lucie for their time and expertise today. Just really a big thank you to you both. Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then Ronald and Lucie, I just had a couple quick questions I wanted to make sure to ask. I thought there were, so one is, are there any strategic advantages to seeking a bill sponsor in one chamber versus the other? I think that's a quick question, quick answer.
I'm sorry, is there a strategic advantage to picking a sponsor in either chamber, House or Senate?
Yes, correct.
Yeah, so that is a great question. So there are political dynamics inherent in both the Senate and the House. They're very different in each chamber. I would say, generally speaking, if you're introducing a bill for the very first time on a topic that you're unsure of how much broad support you're going to get, the House is going to give you an easier time, especially if you're only introducing in one chamber. But if you're introducing or plan to introduce bicamerally, there isn't necessarily a strategic advantage to introducing in one before the other. It can be more difficult to introduce a single chamber in Senate if you're just starting out in the Senate for the first time, just given there are only 100 senators and there are 435 representatives in the House. So there is that just in terms of dynamic, but also the politics in each chamber is a little bit different. So generally speaking, if you're introducing in only one chamber House, if you're introducing bicamerally in both chambers, there isn't really a strategic advantage, but also clearing the Senate first might be to your advantage. It depends on the policy.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Lucie. And last question, and I think this might be a good question for you, Ronald, is there an example of how different it might look to respond to proposed rules or programs when public administration changes? So this person is thinking more like in terms of changes in administration for presidencies, for example, maybe like the Trump presidency to the Biden presidency. So what does it look like to respond to proposed rules and programs and laws when those different administration changes happen?
Well, I think if your question is depending upon who the president is and the administration, I think that's really a very important factor. And I think that is why also the administrative advocacy sometimes has to go hand in hand with the legislative advocacy and the voting. I mean, who is in the White House, who the president selects to be in the agencies makes a tremendous difference. We have certainly interpretations of rules, of the laws through rules and regulations that in the current administration that are very, very different from the ones that we had in the previous administration. So, but that engaging with the officials is important, but who the officials are makes all the difference in the world. And which is why our forever pitch is voting is important. Elections make a difference because who those administrators are and who selects them is the difference between a good rule and a rule that is bad for our community.
Awesome. I think that's a great way to round us out, Ronald. And thank you so much to you both again, and to everyone for sticking around. We had an amazing attendance. I think almost 60 people joined, and a bunch of folks have stayed even after. So thank you all. And PWN Fellows and H&P Advocates, I'll see you soon. Again, thank you again, Ronald and Lucie, for your time.
Thank you,
and knowledge
Amanda.
today. All right. I'll see y'all.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.